Oh, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. And so over the past 2 days, we've heard a lot about botnets. We've heard a lot about the technical aspect of botnets. And what I want to talk to you about today is more about botmasters and the people that are behind the botnets. So what we constantly hear is, how botnets work and how they operate and their payloads and everything. But we rarely see a botmaster that is actually arrested. One was arrested apparently a few days ago, so that kind of ruined my punch. But usually we don't see many of them getting arrested, and so today we're going to see and try and learn a bit more about who they are, how they work, and how we can find basically the key players, the key botmasters, especially when they're dealing and renting out their services in illicit online forums. So if we go back to the good old days of criminals, well, we saw that if you want to find a suitable co-offender, what you had to do was to go to some shady bar and ask around and hope that you can find someone that you can work with or someone that you can buy your illicit services or goods from. So basically, this is where you used to go. More recently, what we've seen is that criminals have become more sophisticated, and right now they've chosen to move online in many cases. And in some of them, they've moved to online web forums where they can try and sell either their illicit goods and services. So basically, these illicit web forums have become what we call convergence settings for online offenders. And basically, as I'm pretty sure you all know, well, these forums come with their own social organization where you're going to have administrators going to be administrating the market, but not the individuals. You're going to have moderators, you're going to have trusted sellers, you're going to have members. And so basically there's this whole social organization of these online platforms where offenders are not told what to do by these administrators, but they're told how to behave in these platforms. There's usually a very strong division of labor, so basically people can just specialize in one area and they don't have to be jack of all trades anymore. So basically if you're very good at writing viruses, you don't need anymore to write these viruses and then launch them in the wild and then see what happens. You can just sell them off to someone else who's going to be using them to steal the information that you need, for example, the financial information. When we look at these illicit forums or illicit online platforms, we see that they've become very, very big, as I'm sure pretty much everyone here knows. And we're talking about a lot of money that being exchanged on these platforms. There's a whole variety of them. If you look on the drug side, for example, I'm pretty sure everyone here is familiar with Silk Road, where it was claimed that they had hundreds of millions of dollars of sales every year, though that number is very debatable if you ask me. But still, we've seen a lot of these forums generate a lot of money, millions of dollars in revenues for these offenders. So it's not really surprising to see them attract a lot of individuals. If people go to these online platforms, these online web forums, basically, there's a lot of reasons, and I've put 4 of them over here. And the first one is that they provide some sort of basic protection and means of resolving conflicts. So of course, when you're an offender and you want to rent out a botnet, for example, and someone just scams you or they told you that they had a botnet in case, well, they didn't, well, you can go to a judge, you can go to the police. So if you want to get back your money, it's very difficult to get it back unless you go through one of these forums. You can ask the administrators to moderate the conflict for you. We also see these forums are really used for social networking, so basically to find suitable co-offenders, talk with others, learn more about your craft, learn more about what you're doing. You can also use them to gather information about other offenders. So basically, if I'm out in the market to rent services from someone, if I go on these forums, then I can get to learn more about these individuals, look at the messages they posted in the past, look at their past behavior, and learn more about their trustworthiness, if you will, through their past interactions. And finally, you get some sort of product assessment, whereas you're going to look at what the person has sold in the past and kind of learn through the feedback that other people have posted if they have a good or not product that they want to rent or sell. Now, unfortunately for these offenders, these online web forums are pretty good for them, but they're also pretty bad on many levels. First of all, when you look at what the law enforcement can do to them, well, first of all, you have a centralized point of information where you have a lot of data on a lot of individuals. So these have become very attractive targets for law enforcement agencies. And we've seen a lot of them taken down over the past few years. Even more recently, as I mentioned, Silk Road was taken down. But we've seen a lot of other markets have been shut down in the past. We also see that not only is this information centralized, the information is also archived. So this means that you can go back years in the past and find information about offenders. So basically, when you're trying to build your investigation, your police investigations, or even if you're just a researcher trying to find information on these individuals, these become very interesting sources of information that we need to look at. Finally, the police or even the researchers can just log in, create their accounts, and try to generate some interactions with these offenders and try to learn more from them through these interactions. So being an offender is not very easy on these forums, but then you also have to worry about law enforcement agencies, but you also have to worry about other offenders. And we've seen in many cases where you're going to have administrators of these online platforms that are going to cheat and steal from their own market participants. So for example, in some cases, when people are going to be selling credit card numbers, they're going to go on these forums and the administrators are going to offer a service of validating the credit card numbers. But what they're doing is just telling you that every single credit card number that you see is valid, and they're just going to steal a copy of the credit card number. So basically, you have to worry about the administrators, and then you also have to worry about the other participants who may be stealing from you. So what happens is that these online web forums have many benefits, but they also have many problems. And the main problem being is, how can you trust anyone in these communities? In the good old days, if we go back to the bar and everything, you can see that this guy basically, you can pretty know he's an offender just by looking at his, nice smile and the way he dresses, the tattoos and everything. You can just feel he's a criminal. When you move online, unfortunately, well, I'm sorry. I hope he's not watching, by the way. So basically, but when you move to these online web platforms, knowing who is a real offender and who is not is very difficult. So basically what the offenders have done is they've adapted these automatic feedback systems, as you can see on eBay, as you can see on Amazon, where they're all going to rate each other on their reputation, basically based on their past interactions. Usually you have two systems. Either it's based on the administrators, so the administrators only control the reputation, or in some other cases you're going to have a peer-based reputation system where pretty much everyone in the market can just rate each other. And so the aim of this research was to look at these reputation levels, because they become basically over the past few years the single most effective way to evaluate the trustworthiness of other offenders in these markets. And basically they've become very central, and that's one of the main ways to evaluate the trustworthiness of others. And so we wanted to understand a bit more how these reputation scales work, because they range from, as you know, from -infinity to over infinity, and you can just earn or lose points basically. And so we wanted to learn exactly how they work. And the first thing that we found is that it's very important to incorporate time in all of your analysis. Reputation is something that's very dynamic, that's going to change over time. And if you just come in at one point in single time and just look at the reputation scores of someone, it's not going to be representative of their true reputation. You need to take into account how it has evolved through time. And pretty much no one has looked at that before. So what we wanted to look at, first of all, is the importance of time and how this reputation scale evolves through times, and if possible, try and build clusters of these profiles of offenders online. The second thing we wanted to do is to look at how important is it to have a good reputation online. And to do that, we're going to look at the strategic positioning of offenders in these networks. And we're going to try and see if strategic positioning, so basically being a key player in these networks, is very important, and is it correlated to reputation? And we're hoping it is. So what we did is I built an online web scraper, which I'm sure everyone here has done in the past. And we went to an online web forum where we had botnet related goods and services that were sold online. And so we had about 4,723 profiles that were active. Of course, it's very difficult to know if it's, every single profile is matched with a single person, or if a person had many profiles. That's why I'm going to try and talk about profiles and not individuals. And we had two criteria for our samples, basically. The first one was that you had to be active for at least 12 months, because we're going to be using our analysis during time. And the second thing is, of course, since we're talking about reputation, you have to gain at least 1 reputation point, or lost 1 reputation point if you're just bad during that period. So basically what we did is we used the 12th month of every single of these profiles, and we looked at the evolution of reputation for these first 12 months. We had the exact same scale for everyone. No, not a sample for 2 years for someone who was active for 2 years, 1 year for someone who was active for 1 year. So basically we just took a snapshot of 1 year of the activity on the forum. What we did is we took two different approaches. The first one that we did is we used the k-means clustering algorithm, which basically allows us to create just clusters of profiles of reputation, just to match profiles together to see how the reputation evolved through time. And so we managed to create 4 clusters basically. And so you're going to have, and you're going to see my sexy graph later on, with the different paths and the different paths of people, the reputation of people, how it evolves through times. I'm really bad with finding good names for clusters, so if you guys have suggestions, for now they're just called A, B, C, and D. But if you have suggestions, you just let me know later on. Now what's really interesting is that reputation does go up and it also goes down. So basically what we wanted to do, and for pretty much, well, for 3 of the 4 clusters, we see the reputation go up and then the reputation go down. So what we wanted to know was, when your reputation is going up, what is your strategic positioning based on social network measures, and when your reputation is going down, what is your strategic positioning one again? So what we did is we created 2 intervals, or we divided this 12-month period in 2, depending on if your reputation was going up or if your reputation was going down, and then we compared your strategic positioning in the network based on these 2 intervals. And we used 2 measures. So for you who are not familiar with social network measures, they're really fun. The first one we use is degree centrality, and degree centrality is very easy. Basically, it's just the number of contacts that you have. So if you're talking, if you, for example, have 12 conversations with someone, then your degree centrality is going to be 12. Betweenness centrality measures your indirect links. So basically, degree centrality is a measure of your direct links, and betweenness centrality measures your indirect links. So these individuals who have a very high score of betweenness centrality, they're the brokers, the power brokers. They're the people who control the flow of information. So even if someone has a very small number of contacts, maybe he's really important because he's controlling all of the information. He's serving as a bridge between 2 groups of individuals. So these people who have a very high score of betweenness are very interesting people. And that's 2 ways usually you're going to measure the positioning of someone in a network. That's by using these 2 measures. So, I put the numbers in red. That's where you should look right now so you don't get too confused. So basically, if you look at the sample, you have the 4 clusters here, and that's the descriptive statistics. And you can see that the numbers, the sample is not divided equally amongst all of the clusters. So basically, you're going to have cluster A when you have a majority of the sample, and as you're going down, you're going to have a smaller and smaller sample. So basically, you're going to go from 1,300 all the way down to 152. So actually, it's a guess that reputation is not distributed evenly in this form. What you also see is when you look at the number of days that these people were active, so that's between their registration date and the last time they were online, so their last message that they posted online, you see that these people were pretty active, and they were active for a long period of time. So we're going from 761 for cluster B all the way down to 663 for cluster C. So there's not much of a difference when you look at the number of days. There's about, I think, a 15% difference between the 2. So usually it was a pretty homogeneous groups, whereas you didn't have a lot of differences when you look at the number of days that they were active on the forum. When you look at their age, on average, it's between 23 and 24, so not a lot of differences there. Once again, this was self-reported, so we have no clue if they're really 22 or 24, but I just thought I would put it in there for you guys, if you like it. What's really interesting, and that's something I'm going to be going back later on in my presentation, is that's a number of times that they change their nickname. And it's really interesting to see that you go from only 3.8 in cluster A, which is still kind of surprising if you ask me, all the way down to 12.9 for cluster D. So that's really interesting to see that some people are going to change their nickname a lot more often, and we're going to see how that correlates with reputation. And so we'll see if that is important later on. The forum also measured the number of times they were actually online, so that's always an approximative measure, of course. And you see here that there's a lot of differences once again. And you see that these people who change their nickname more often, they also spend a lot of time on the forum. We're talking about 1,400 hours, that's always the mean, compared to 468 if you look at cluster A in the top. When you look at the number of people that each of these individuals referred on average, not much of a difference. Still, it's kind of 2x if you compare cluster A to cluster B once again. And when you look at the number of posts that they put online, you see that it goes from 30 on average to 51 at the bottom. And of course, you have a lot of differences when you look at the standard deviation. These numbers change quite a lot. So this is why you're all here this morning. So that's the k-means clustering, and basically you have the 4 clusters. So you have the 4 lines and colors, and you have the evolution through time from the first month till the 12th month, and then you have the number of reputation points through time. So it's really interesting to see that, of course, you have cluster A, which was the largest cluster of all, where you have basically only a very, very limited number of reputation points, and these guys just flatline from point A to point B. So basically, they're the guys who have a reputation, but it's very poor from beginning to end. When you have cluster B, which is a really interesting cluster, they start very slow, and at first, they're unable basically to build up their reputation. Then they learn what signs and signals they're supposed to send to actually earn a reputation, and we see that they're going up in the second half of the sample. When you look at cluster C, it's exactly the opposite. So they're really, really good to get reputation early on, but then it goes down very early. And then you have cluster D, which is just going up for most of the sample, and then it's going down a bit at the end. So when I'm going to be comparing basically the positioning of these individuals, you can see that for cluster A, which is divided in 2, so we're comparing the first 6 months to the last 6 months because it's pretty flat all over. When we're looking at cluster B, we're comparing their first 8 months to their last 4 months, so their positioning in the network, their social network measures before and after. Cluster C, we compare their first 4 months to the last 8 months. And then for cluster D, we use the first 8 months when it's going up to the last 4 months when it's going down. But basically what you can already see is that if you're looking at just raw reputation scores, you're always going to focus on reputation on the cluster D, but there's some more stuff that's going on in there. We're going to look at it, how it goes. So what we did is we ran a means differences to check if there were differences when you're looking at the centrality degree and the betweenness degree between each of these clusters. And what you should be looking at is this last column to the right, which is the Kruskal-Wallis test, which just checks if there's differences between cluster A, B, C, and D. And since the test is significant, so it's 0.000, it means that there are differences between each of these clusters, though we don't know yet between which. Same goes for betweenness in the first interval. So basically what we see is that there's differences between the clusters, and we're going to see in a second exactly which differences there are. When we look in the second interval, once again, at degree and at betweenness, what we see is that there are differences. So basically the strategic positioning of these individuals is going to be different depending on which cluster they belong to. So I put it on a table for you so it's easy to read. And you should read it row by row. And what we're looking is, when we're looking at degree centrality in the first interval at least, we see that cluster A has a smaller degree than cluster B, than cluster C, and that cluster D. That cluster B has a smaller centrality than cluster C and D, and that there's no statistical difference between C and D. So if we go back to the graph, what we see basically is that, of course, A is smaller than everyone else, B is bigger than A but smaller than everyone else, and there's no differences between C and D. So just by using this reputation score, which is pretty easy to do and pretty much anyone can do, we can already identify the key players, the power brokers in this network, just by using this reputation scale. If we look at the second interval, what's really interesting is that A is still the sucker and is always smaller than B, C, and D. But this time, B is over C and D, so B is bigger than C and D. And there's still no differences between C and D, unfortunately. So what we see is that in the second interval, when we see that B is rising, we also see its presence, its importance in the network grow, and we can see that through their reputation scores, but we can also see that through their social network measure score. So basically, we see that B is now the most important person, the most important group of individuals in this online forum as compared to A, C, and D. And with this, we only get through reputation as well as through the social network source. When we look at betweenness centrality in the first interval, we get pretty much the same picture as we had before, except because C is smaller than D. In this case, the difference is significant. So if we go back once again, of course, then we see that D is the biggest brokers, and that's not surprising because they're the ones who are going a lot with reputation. They have a lot of reputation going on compared to the other ones. And we see still that B is smaller than C and D, and that A is smaller than everyone else, basically. When we look in the second interval, though, what we see, and that's really interesting, is once again it's reversed for B, and we see that B, if you go back to the graph, B is still one of the biggest key players right now, and they're the ones who are controlling basically the flux of information in the second interval. So what does that tell us? Well, first of all, the thing that we have to understand is that it's very difficult to build a reputation on these forums. As you can see, A, which was the flatline group, was the one who had the biggest N in the sample, so it's the biggest group, and these individuals had a very small amount of reputation. But there was also a lot of other profiles who did not have any reputation at all. So just getting a reputation is not easy, and getting a strong reputation is even more difficult. So basically, you have to understand that it's very difficult to build your reputation online, and only a small group is actually able to do it. What we've also learned is that reputation has been linked to criminal achievement. So at least where I come from, we really like offenders, and we like good offenders because they're nice to study, and we can learn a lot from them. And so basically what we've seen is that reputation is linked to criminal achievement, basically. And that if you look at this reputation, well, it's not surprising to see that only a small number of people has a good reputation, because only a small number of offenders are actually successful, as you all know, I'm pretty sure. So basically what we've seen is that there's already a discrimination based on reputation. We can use this reputation to identify the key players in these networks. The only problem that we've had, and if you remember, if we go back to the number of individuals in each of the clusters, well, you're going to have a lot of people in these clusters. So basically, if you look at cluster B, I think it was around 300 people. Well, if you're a researcher, if you're a law enforcement agency, and you look at this reputation, you're like, well, that's very fun, that's nice, and then you create the clusters and everything, but you still end up with 300 targets that you have to look at. And that's one of the limits of this approach, is that it's kind of a first trim to get you to know who are the key players in these networks. And then you can use other techniques, you can use content analysis, you can use other stuff to look at these profiles, to learn more about these individuals. But at least you know who you should be targeting right now, and you can also look at who you should be targeting in the future. Because one of the features of this type of analysis basically is that you can see who's very popular now, but who's also on an upward trend, so you get to know basically who's going to be the next key players in the network, and that's how you should be doing it. What comes out of this basically is the question is, do all participants want to have a very high reputation? That's a very good question. So if you're a smart offender and you realize that, well, police is going to be monitoring these reputation systems, they're going to be looking at it to see exactly who are the key players in these networks. Then becomes a question of, if you're in this efficiency versus security scale, well, do you want to have a very good reputation score on these forums? If you want to have a good reputation score, you're going to have a lot of benefits, because people are going to be willing to transact with you. They're going to be able to trust you more easily because of your reputation scores on these forums. At the same time, you're going to be the target of police investigations. So do you really want to have a high scores? Some people might be interested in keeping actually their reputation scores as low as possible and use other methods, for example, very high social networking, offering free samples of their service, free sample of their goods to other people, and basically try other stuff to convince people of their trustworthiness and bypass, if you will, these reputation scores. So when we're going to be analyzing this data, we have to keep in mind that, and we're going to have to look more into this and see exactly, is everyone interested to get more reputation or is it not? The other thing that's really interesting is when you look at the reliability of these online offenders, basically. And you saw that some offenders are very good at first, then they're bad. We saw that some offenders were pretty bad, then they end up good. But we see that there's a lot of changes in these patterns and these paths of reputation. So the question we have to ask is, how reliable are offenders and how reliable are these online markets, basically? And so what we've seen is that these offenders are going to steal from each other. And there's been some questions regarding, should we even investigate these forums, because there's so much ripping off between these individuals that we should just let them rip each other off, and they're just going to take care of each other. And to see that these patterns of reputation go up and then go down, it kind of indicates that people, they try to behave good, or they try to give a good image of themselves, and then they use this good image to steal from others, and that's when their reputation goes down. So it's really interesting to see some traces of these problems in these markets just based on this reputation. And we're going to need to learn a bit more about how reliable, and if the key players, how long do they stay key players, how long do they stay active in there, and how important can they be over the long term. So, to conclude, I have no clue how much time I have. No, pretty good. So, basically, we see that these automated reputation systems are very good tools to understand the social organization of markets. And what's really fun for us is that these reputation tools have to be open and accessible to all. If that's the tool that you're going to be using to evaluate other people, basically, they have to be accessible to pretty much everyone on these markets. When you're looking at building up these social organization through social network measures, it's a lot more difficult to get your data because you have to create ties between individuals. It's a lot more work. If you can use just these reputation measures, basically, it's a lot easier. And since it's open and accessible to all, well, then you can just use these. And what we need to do is actually better understand these individuals. And I think that I know most of you are not looking at this type of data, but I think that it's a very important source of data to learn more about these offenders, and how we can prevent crime is by learning more about them. And I think that going through this process of learning who are the key players, and then learning from these individuals, we can prevent, instead of always being reactive, always collecting samples and seeing how it works, we can use this data to find out exactly how they're working before they launch their products, basically. And so I'm going to end with a quote, which says that few people think more than 2 or 3 times a year, and I have made an international reputation for myself by thinking once or twice a week, by George Bernard Shaw. And here you have a beautiful picture of Lausanne. If you guys want to visit, you just let me know. So that's it for me.
One, two. Yeah. 1, 2 questions.
Thank you, Mark, Arbor Networks. I think you make an assumption about sort of the trustworthiness of these people leaving reputation scores for each other. And I think one of the big problems in a lot of the online reputation you mentioned eBay and auction sites is the concept of shilling, or basically creating accounts to boost one's reputation. And it seems like some of the social media metrics that you compute would be interesting to evaluate that. So is that something you've looked at? And is it a problem in online forums, or generally are the feedback mechanisms honest and not manipulated?
I didn't hear your question, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Speak louder.
Yeah, please.
All right. My question is, one of the problems with a lot of online reputation sort of scores is this concept of shilling, or creating accounts in order to boost, falsely boost reputation. And I think, you assume that these markets are honest to some extent. I think we need to assume that there's an adversarial component to this. And so it seems like some of the social media metrics that you use would be very useful to figure out if people are creating accounts just to boost reputation or things like this. And I wonder if you considered that, and if so, if you have any results to share. You also mentioned, for example, that the forum names were changed often. That seems like it could also point to sort of the same system being gained.
We're actually working on this project right now, where we're actually cracking the passwords of. We received a dump from a law enforcement agency of another forum, and so we're trying to find the deceptive behavior of individuals on these forums. So we're trying to see how many profiles which person has, and so one of the things we're doing is we're cracking their passwords, and we're guessing that people are going to use the same password or same patterns of password on their different accounts. So we're going to try and crack their passwords. We're going to try and see if they use the same email addresses, they use the same similar usernames as well. And so we're going to try to use authorship identification as well to try and find out if they're using the same profile, different profiles, and if they're using the same profiles at the same time, different profiles 2 times, and trying to build up this deceptive behavior. So we should have results maybe next year, hopefully, but the computers are cracking the password as we speak, and we're just waiting for it to come out. One thing I can tell you is that it's really interesting, and I was talking to one of your colleagues about, we often see analysis of user passwords, and one of the things that we were really interested to see is to do password analysis of offenders, something we don't really see. And we were just looking at the numbers very rapidly, and it was really interesting to see that these offenders are going to be using, for example, Mom123, Pokemon. They have a lot of, just random stuff, and you would not expect from offenders basically that they would use as passwords. And I must say that the most common password, you guessed it, 123, 123.
Thank you.